14 years at Microsoft. I wrote the help that you see when you write get help. I was a member of the PowerShell team from PowerShell 1 through 3. And I'm also a PowerShell MVP. So the title of this talk is Avoiding Version Chaos in a Multi-Version World. And it's not avoiding a multi-version world, right? It's just trying to control and understand how to work in a world with multiple versions. We haven't had to do that in PowerShell. So this is the versions on which the code and slides were tested, and everything is up on GitHub. So there are lots of different supported versions of PowerShell now. It's not even Windows PowerShell anymore. There's PowerShell on the Mac and PowerShell on Linux. So in addition to the traditional versions of 2, 3, 4, and 5, we now have 5.0.n.n and 5.1.n.n, and now we have PowerShell 6 Alpha out on GitHub. So people playing with the GitHub version, GitHub PowerShell?
Mac.
Huh?
I downloaded my Mac.
Yeah. Yeah, it works. It's Windows, Mac, and Linux.
So yesterday we did the day course on it. We were showing the GitHub function a lot.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, so there are tons of versions of PowerShell. And now, in addition to the traditional versioning, where it just had a major version at 0, we now have the PowerShell team using all 4 properties of the versioning element. And PowerShell 5 isn't final. It updates with Windows Update, and you can see them using the major, minor, build, and revision numbers. PowerShell is generally backward compatible, but it's not backported. So if they add a new feature, it's not guaranteed to work on a previous version, but the previous code is always guaranteed to work on the next version. And PowerShell 6 Alpha changes every day. And they're actually using a new versioning object, and we'll talk about that today. Semantic versioning. In addition to PowerShell coming in more versions, modules are coming from many more sources. They're all versioned. Some may be backward compatible, some not, because we have this diversity of versions. Things are on PowerShell Gallery, they're on PowerShell Get, they're on NuGet, they're on GitHub. You can get modules from friends. There's sort of a proliferation of modules, and that's a really good thing because more people are solving more problems. But we're going to end up with versioning issues too. And beginning in PowerShell 5, we have side-by-side module versions, which means that you can install different versions of the same module on the same computer. You can install different versions in different paths or in the same path, and you can import them all at the same time. Now, you would probably never want to do this, okay? But if you're writing shared code, either code for your enterprise or code that you're going to put up on PowerShell Gallery and share, you can never predetermine what's going on the target system, and you need to be ready for anything. You can have commands with the same name in different modules. Oh, and I should point out that down here in the lower right corner, I have references. So these are either blogs or videos or articles. Some of them are mine, and some of them are written by other people. But when you guys get the deck, these are hot links, and you can, for every slide, you can go and grab the reference. So you can have commands with different names in different modules, and commands different modules with the same name. Sometimes they differ by version, sometimes they don't. They should differ by GUID, but there was a break in the PoshGit module that people were using, and it was delivering the same GUID to every module that used it. Okay, so you can't even count on the GUID where the U stands for unique, being truly unique. So what could go wrong, right? Which version of PowerShell do I need? Which version of a module do I need? Which version of the module is imported by default? When I run the command unqualified, which version of the command runs? How do I know how the versions differ? And most importantly, how do I assure that the scripts and modules that I share with others run the commands that I intend? And that's sort of what this talk is about. And what we don't want to end up with is one of these things where the module requirements are very complex and require a lot of luck. And we actually had this situation. So I'm pretty old, but back in the 80s, we had situations, especially with Lisp and Perl, where there were so many different dependencies. It was really difficult for anyone to assemble the correct little puzzle parts to get the code to work. So how do they even do this side-by-side versioning? I'm gonna show you how it's done. So I've got a console here. I'm first gonna show you what I'm running. I'm in version 5.1.14393.206. So it's just the current build of PowerShell 5.1. And here's a typical module the way we're used to seeing it. There's the module directory, and inside the module directories you have the module files. But this isn't the only way it's done now. In fact, you're more likely to see something like this, where you open the module directory, and instead of seeing the module files, you see a bunch of subdirectories with version names. Okay? And in fact, this is how PowerShell Get installs module versions, even if you don't upload them to PowerShell Get in this way. And instead, the code is inside that version directory. Now, if you take a module like this and you run it on PowerShell 4 in a version directory, the module commandlets will not recognize it as a legitimate module. So if you're distributing modules in your organization and some of the machines have PowerShell 5, PowerShell 5 and later understands these version subdirectories. PowerShell 4 and earlier will not even recognize it as a module. So if it's in a path, an envps module path, and you run get module on it, get module will not find it. Import module will not import it. So on PowerShell 4 and earlier, the versions of PowerShell Get and package management do not deliver those version subdirectories, okay, so that the modules will work. And because we're a small group, feel free to jump in with questions if you have them. So even if you didn't intentionally install multiple versions of the same module in the same directory on your machine, and you use PowerShell Get, update module in PowerShell Get will do it for you. Because what it does, if it finds a newer version of the module, it doesn't replace your current version of the module with the newest version of the module. It adds it in the same directory, and you can't even change it. Okay? And I tested it. You can see in the blue, that's PowerShell 5.1, and in the slinky black, we have PowerShell 6 Alpha. So to avoid this sort of version chaos, you need to require a version of PowerShell, require and import the versions of the modules you need, specify the commands that run, and when you're writing, make sure that you note the versions that you're using in blogs and help and videos and whatever you're doing, so that people understand in case they try your examples and they don't work. It might be because they're running a different version. So we all know how to require a version of PowerShell, right? Pound requires -version. Let's see what happens. So here I have a pound requires statement for PowerShell version 4, and I'm going to run it here. And here's what it says. It requires version 4. I don't have version 4. I have version 5.1.14393, right? So what we learned here is that pound requires specifies the minimum version, okay, not the exact version. And usually that's exactly what you want, especially because PowerShell is backwards compatible. But it's good to know that it's a minimum. Okay, let's try another one. I'm going to be a bit more specific now in my version requirement. I'm going to require version 5.1.99999. And let's run that script again. Whoops. And it tells me it requires version 5.1.99999, and I have this version, but I didn't get an error.
Interesting.
And that's,
Interesting.
And that's because pound requires looks only at the major and minor properties of the version number. And that was because it was developed in a time when we had 1.0 and 2.0 and 3.0 and 4.0. And we didn't have 5.1.14393. Now, if in fact you have something greater, it will error out. Pound requires works like it always does. Okay. And it will tell you, whoops, did I grab the wrong one? Oops. Demos. There we go. I want to require version 6. Run that in the console. And of course, it tells me that it has a pound requires statement that's not satisfied. And if I run this in PowerShell 6, that will work. But look at this one. Here, I'm requiring version 6.0.1. I'm going to copy the file path here and run it in my PowerShell 6 console. And we have the same issue. I'm requiring 6.0.1. It's 6.0.0. It does not meet the minimum requirement, but it's only looking at major and minor. So, on PowerShell 5 and earlier, I use something like this. I just use a simple if statement that converts a version object and compares it to a string. And when I run this one, it correctly tells me that it requires PowerShell 5.1.99999, and you don't have it, okay? Any questions? We're a little group. Is this useful?
Yes.
Okay, good, good,
Very
good.
much.
Okay, so what we've learned here is that pound requires specifies the minimum version, not a required version, and it inspects only the major and minor properties, not built-in revision, and it works the same way on PowerShell 6 Alpha. Lee Holmes warned me not to say PowerShell 6 yet, because it's not released. And to require a version of Windows PowerShell, including the built-in revision numbers, you just use a comparison operator or the compare to method on the PS version table object. So let's talk for a minute about what's going on in PowerShell 6 Alpha, right? There's a brand new type of version object. Instead of good old versioning with major, minor, build, and revision, we now have major, minor, patch, and label. And if you send it to get member, you see that you have a brand new kind of object, a system.management.automation semantic version object. And I'm a big fan of semantic versioning, so I'm going to give you a little spiel about that. So normal versioning is quite arbitrary. In fact, I've seen groups sort of get together and say, well, when are we going to increment the build number, right? Or is this really a major version kind of case where we increment the major version number? And it's pretty arbitrary. And you, as the system administrator, can't even predict what a change, oh good, fall. You can't even predict what a change in versioning means when you look at a change in the version number. But semantic versioning has rules for when the different properties are incremented. And here, this is the specification for semantic versioning. And I just had lunch with the PowerShell team, and they assured me that while they hadn't yet, oh, thank you, while they hadn't yet implemented semantic versioning, they have every intention to do so. So the way it works is that when the label field, which is now alpha, that's basically for pre-release work. So it'll go from alpha to beta and probably stop, and then they'll release, okay? And typically, you don't need to worry about that label value in the version number unless you're working on GitHub with different versions, right? If you're doing pre-release work, then you might need to test for this label. The patches for bug fixes, again, might not be important to you unless your code depends on that fix. Or your code depends on it not being fixed, right? Okay? Minor is for new features that are backward compatible but not backported, and they increment the major version for breaking changes. Okay? Now, what we're seeing, and this was part of my lunch discussion with these folks, is that we've had PowerShell 6.0.0.9, 6.0.0.10, and just the other day they released 6.0.0.11, but they have not incremented this number at all. Okay? And apparently what's going on is it's not that they're not using semantic versioning, it's that they're not using it yet. And they will begin to increment the properties of the version object at release time. Okay? Basically, they haven't figured out how they're going to do it. Okay? And one way, though, that you can test the version, PS version table has a Git ID. PS version table has a Git commit ID that has the regular version number, including the label and the .10. This is just a string. Okay? I can actually show that. Git commit ID, get member, and that's just a string. Okay? But you can parse that string if you absolutely need to know what the version number of a pre-release version. Questions? It's a little odd stuff. Okay. So, pound requires and semantic versioning. Let's take a peek at that. Now, right off the bat, when I put a valid semantic version in pound requires -- version, I get a syntax error. And let's take a peek at that. And it says, the argument for the version parameter is not valid. Specify a valid Windows PowerShell version in the form major minor. Okay? So what this is telling me is that pound requires -- version takes a system.version object, but it is not set up, even in PowerShell 6, to take a semantic version object. So you can't use that. Okay? And if you try to do something like testing for creating a semantic version object and testing for it, and let's do that.
What led you here, just out of curiosity?
What led me here?
Yeah.
Why am I even looking at this?
I'm just, yeah, just.
Oh, so as soon as I watched the version numbers change to 4-part version
Yeah.
numbers, I knew that the pace of change would increase, and that made me want to be able to control the pace of change.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, or at least adapt to it, right? Not stop it, but definitely adapt to it. So here's my little semantic versioning object, and I'm going to run it in the console here in PowerShell 5. Let me restart this to make it a little bit easier to see. Okay. And I'm getting an error, but I'm not getting a version error. I'm getting a type error. So in PowerShell 5, you cannot even define a semantic version. Okay? It does not know that object. System.management.automation.semantic version is defined in the brand new system.management.automation.native image, ni.dll. That's in core CLR. it's not part of the console CLR. So you can't create, or I have not figured out a way, I'm not a developer, but I have not figured out a way to use add type or anything else to add a type that's developed in a native image into PowerShell 5. So you need to do something else if you want to test. This will work, by the way, in PowerShell 6 just fine. It just doesn't work in PowerShell 5. And if your code might be tested in 5 and 6, you have to have something that works in both. So you can actually take a string and, oops. Well, let's test it in PowerShell 5 first. So what I've done here is I've created a string with what looks like a semantic version object, and PowerShell is going to convert it for me. Okay? So I can run this in PowerShell 5 just fine. And it says this requires PowerShell 6.0.1.alpha, running an earlier version. And I'm going to copy the file path and run it in PowerShell 6. And here it's reporting that we need 6.0.1 alpha and we have 6.0.0 alpha. Okay, and now I just talked to Jason at lunch, so you get a little bit of late breaking news. I discovered a bug, and Jason confirms that it's a bug, but it might not be fixed. So let me show this to you. It's a little odd. Okay, I'm attempting to test for a semantic version, and I set a minimum version, and that's a version object with all 4 properties populated. Okay? And when I compare it, note that when I run it in PowerShell 6, the semantic version is on the left, and the version object is on the right, and that matters because PowerShell, when it does type conversion, it always converts to the first type that it encounters, left to right. So when I run this in PowerShell 6, it says that it can't convert the value, so it can't convert that version object to a semantic version object. But if all I do is swap the order, and I'll show you what I'm doing up here. You can see here that I'm just switching the positions of minimum version and PS version table. Okay. And I run that again in PowerShell 6. It runs just fine. Okay. So it can convert a semantic version to a version, but it can't convert a version to a semantic version. So the moral of the story is not to memorize this. It's always to test your code and to test your code on all systems. Okay. So what we've discovered here is that pound requires takes a version object but not a semantic version object. So you could do a pound requires dash version 6.0.0 but not 6.0.0.alpha. And again, excuse me, it looks at the major and minor properties of the version number only. So to test patch or label in the semantic versioning object, you need to use a comparison operator. And you can compare version strings to semantic version and be sure to test because the order of the elements matters. Okay, and this is the string code that we actually use to test it, and this works just fine. You can't create a semantic version object less than 6, but you can use a version string. Okay. Any questions? Okay, so I have my version of PowerShell, and now I want to be able to get my module, and I want to get a specific version of the module, and I want to make sure that I have the right module. So one of the things I can do to see what's changed in a version is to use the new release notes property in PowerShell 5. Okay? It's property of the objects that the PowerShell get commandlets return, and it's also a new property of the get module object, which seems to change with every release, right? And the only thing that's important to know, this is really great and you can really see release notes. The only thing you need to remember is that find module and get installed module, the PowerShell get commandlets, get the release notes from an XML file that's installed with the module or script. Okay? Get module gets it from the module manifest. So if you've used find module or get installed module for a module that's installed in your system and you can't get its release notes property, try this one too, because they have different sources. Okay? And they might even be different or give you different information. But they usually give you a whole bunch of information. These are the release notes for PS Readline. And you can get release notes for a single version or get them for all versions so that you can compare the versions. This is super good. And you don't even, because it works on find module, you don't even have to have the module installed, not even saved, to be able to look at the version changes. Also, when you're selecting modules from PowerShell Gallery, there's a new compatible PS additions field in the module manifest. This is the module manifest key that tells you if it requires the full desktop version or it's also compatible with Nano and IoT in Core CLR. Okay? This is sort of important. The problem with using that module manifest key, it's compatible in PowerShell 5.1 and forward only, because when the module commandlets evaluate a module manifest, if there's any key that they don't know, if there's a manifest key that's unfamiliar, they don't ignore the unanticipated key, they error it out. Okay? So if you have a module with a compatible PS Additions module manifest key, and you try to run it in PowerShell 5.0, the module fails. It will not import, get module won't get it. Yeah, so when they're adding new keys to the module manifest, you'll notice that they're adding them in private data.ps data, so it's a hash table within a hash table. It's almost a module manifest inside a module manifest to hide it from this feature of the interpretation of module manifests. Yeah, oh, cool. Okay. Questions? Just interesting, cool. Yeah, I think it's interesting too. Okay, so I want to require a module, and in fact I want to require a specific version of a module. So there are several different tools that are available to me. I can use #requires-module. And I can use it with a string or a module specification object, and let's take a look at that. So the first thing we want to do is figure out what the default behavior is if I don't specify anything. So I'm just going to do a get module-list for the pester module. And let me restart the shell. See it. Good. Now, I play with Pester a lot, and I was involved, I helped with some of the development on Pester, so I have a whole bunch of different versions of the Pester module. Okay? The newest one is up here. It's version 3.4.3. So, by default, when I use #requires-module Pester, and I'm just going to CLS here, it gets me 3.4.3. So it looks like it's getting the newest version of the module that I have. Now that would be terrific. However, if I switch this to Script Analyzer, bit of cutting and pasting because #requires always has to be the first line in your script. So let's take a peek at the version of Script Analyzer modules that I have. And we'll do get module-list for Script Analyzer. And I have a whole bunch of versions of Script Analyzer too. And in this case, my newest version is this one, 1.7.0, the one that they just released in the past few weeks. But if I run my nifty script here with the #requires, it doesn't get the newest one. In fact, There are several versions that are newer. So, this is super important. For import module, for pound requires, for module auto loading, and for get module, and let's see, pound requires and the new using statement in PowerShell 5, and we'll take a peek at that. PowerShell goes through all of your PS module path directories in the order that they're listed in the env PS module path variable. It goes to the first directory and it says, do I have a module with that name? And the first one that it finds that satisfies the conditions, and in this case we've only given it a name, it returns. Okay? Now, very few people know what the order of paths are on their own PS module path, as, you know, notwithstanding that they know what it might be on a target system that they can't even anticipate. Okay? But the default is the very first conforming version in the very first directory in PS module path. If it looked in this directory and didn't find any versions of Script Analyzer, it would go to the next directory in my PS module path and check for one of those.
So then you could force it by adding it to that pass statement.
We're getting there. Yes, yeah, you can change it, but,
You could force it.
right, you could force it, but you wouldn't know what I have on my system,
True, true.
right? And we learned from Azure that you never want to mess with a customer's PS module path. So, there's an easier way,
Okay.
promise. This is the way you do it.
Oh, you give it a.
You have a pound requires statement with a module specification object. Now, what's going to happen here is that, I'm just going to clear this. Okay? Now I was able to require a specific version of that module. Okay? And what happened this time is that the pound requires logic did the very same thing that it always does. It went through PS module path, right? It grabbed the first directory, but here I have more requirements, right? So the very first thing that it found did not satisfy those requirements. So it had to keep looking until it found one that satisfied those requirements. Okay. So let's talk about that module specification object for a sec. I just wanted to point out that the new using statement in PowerShell 5 works exactly the same way, and the only thing that it does differently is that it imports the classes defined in a module. And I want to mention that because if you do pound requires, import module, or module auto loading, and you have classes defined in a module or script, or classes defined in a module, not a script, it will not import or export those into the session. If you have classes, you must use the using statement. And there's a little blog post that I wrote about that. So this is your new best friend. This is the module specification object. It is not new. It was introduced in PowerShell 3. And basically, it's just a hash table with some very specific keys. You do not need to cast it and specify that it's a module specification object. When you use it in a place that PowerShell anticipates, you just give it a hash table with the correct keys, and it will convert it for you. Okay. One of the good things about converting it is that if you cast it as a module specification object and your keys are wrong, you'll get a syntax error, right? So that's kind of cool. You get a warning that you've made a mistake. So the way a module specification object looks is it has a module name key. It must have a module name key with a string, okay, followed by any one but only one of these. Module version is the minimum version, then there's maximum version and required version, which was added in PowerShell 5, and then an optional GUID specifier. So you can require a module with module specification object, and let's take a peek at that. Any questions?
So then if you use the
Yeah.
maximum, you could get an earlier version?
What?
Is
Yeah.
that right?
Yeah, yeah, of course. Good logic, Tom. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm gonna show. Yeah, so,
Because you could trip yourself up real easy.
yeah, yeah.
Oh my.
So what you have to do is understand the logic. The logic makes absolute perfect sense,
Mhm.
but it's not intuitive. Okay, so these are the versions of Pester that I have. And I have a pound requires module version. I'm asking for a minimum version of 3.3.10. And you'll notice that I actually do even have 3.3.10 installed. So let's see what happens when I run this. I'm gonna.
So if you were to, that's the minimum version, right? So
That's
if you were to
the-
say 339,
Yeah, watch first.
okay.
Watch, I promise. Promise I'll get there.
Okay. I'll shut up.
So, no, it's fine. Okay, so, no, it's just that we're gonna get there.
Okay.
And if I don't answer your question
problem.
afterward,
Don't
then
worry.
let me know.
No
So,
problem.
when it's done, it's exactly what Tom anticipated. I asked for a minimum of 3.3.10. It grabs PS module path. It goes to that my home directory, which is the very first one. It looks at the very first version of the Pester module that I have, and it says, is this greater than 3.3.10? And it
I love
is.
it.
So it returns it. So it's doing the same thing all over again, right? It's checking the criteria and returning the very first one that it encounters that meets the criteria. It's just, it makes a lot of sense, but it's not what you might anticipate. So I'm gonna switch this to maximum version. Okay. And now I'm gonna say the maximum version is 3.3.10. And it gives me 3.3.9. So let's look at what we have here. Scoop these up so that you can see them. Okay? It's gonna go to that same directory. Does this one work? Does this one work? Does this one work? Does this one work? Oh, that one works. Return it. Okay? So even though we've said that the maximum is 3.3.10, it doesn't even get down here. It returns the first one that meets the specifications that you gave it. And the way to deal with this is actually to use the required version.
But that only
On
works in
PowerShell 5,
Yeah.
right. Otherwise, you just use comparison logic, exactly the way,
Okay, okay.
yeah, exactly the way we did before. But this one, I just want to show you, actually runs and returns, clear, restart the shell, sorry. Restart shell might be my very favorite feature of PowerShell Studio. Good. And now, when I've required 3.3.10, it actually returns it too. So, did I answer your question?
Absolutely.
Okay. We think alike, so
Yeah.
I knew. Okay, so module version is the minimum version, and min and max don't import the earliest or latest versions that you have. They import the first version encountered that meets the requirements that you specified. Those really logical requirements. You can also use a GUID, and this would be the case where you'd use a GUID. I had to sort of manufacture a little bit of this, but I had two PowerShell logging modules. They just happen to both have a version 1.1.0.1, so I can't distinguish them by the version. And that wouldn't be a good idea anyway, but because when you have two entirely different versions with two entirely different set of commands, you want to specify the GUID in the module specification object. Now, the other thing that will help us, in addition to that wonderful module specification object, are version parameters. And the PowerShell team has been slowly adding them to the core modules. So there's been a version parameter that's actually minimum version since PowerShell 3. There's also a required version in PowerShell 3, and they added maximum version in PowerShell 5. And the PowerShell Get and Package Management modules have an all versions parameter as well. And these are the core commandlets that have those version parameters. There are actually quite a few of them, and you'll find them very useful, including save module, which is the alternative to install module. An import module is like Mr. Flexible. So it has a version, by default it imports the first conforming version, but it has a version parameter, maximum version parameter, a required version parameter, and one of these fully qualified name parameters that takes a module specification object. Note that this one was added in PowerShell 5, and this one was added in PowerShell 5. The way the PowerShell team is doing it, these parameters that start with fully qualified name and fully qualified module almost always take, or so far, always take a module specification object. That's your hint. And again, they work exactly the same way. They import the first version that's discovered by default, but you can use those parameters. Get module beginning in PowerShell 4 and remove module beginning in PowerShell 5. Take a module specification object in their fully qualified name parameter. Same rules, okay, for minimum and maximum. And these are the core commandlets with a fully qualified name or fully qualified module parameter that take a module specification object. So I have the right version of PowerShell. I have the version of the module that I need, and now I need to make sure that I get the right command. Now, this is a very odd situation where I happen to have 5 commands with the same name in different modules, okay? But that's contrived. This was done for my testing. But I want to get the right command, and then I want to make sure that I run the right command. And it's not just on my system where I know the environment and I can control it. It might be other people in my enterprise or other people out in the community if I've put something on PowerShell Get. Okay.
Is there a command to get you to fully qualified?
I have one in my profile. I can give it to you. That creates a fully qualified.
Yeah,
it's going to be in PowerShell Studio.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. Okay, so let's take a peek at this. So what I've done here is I have, well, let me show you. I'm going to prep my session. Okay, let's clear that. Okay. Okay. Now, I'm going to do a get command on the expand archive command with a wildcard character. And that will get me all instances of a command. And I've noticed that I have one in none of this is contrived. This is all real world. There's an expand archive function in Microsoft.PowerShell.archive and an expand archive commandlet in the PSCX module. And they're different, and they work differently. So I want to know, let's take a peek at this. Let's have some fun. I want to know which one is going to run by default. Okay. Now, we all know command precedence. Does anybody know the command precedence order by heart? Okay. It's alias, function, commandlet, native command. Okay. So we might guess that by default it will import the function. Let's see what happens. I'm just going to remove that asterisk, and get command will tell me which command runs by default. And it's the commandlet.
Interesting.
Anyone guess why? It's that same module importing thing. It goes to the first instance of a module that has an expand archive commandlet, and it starts in my home directory. So because PSCX, which has the commandlets, is stored in my home directory, and Microsoft.PowerShell.archive is in PS home, it imports this one. And that's not something you can anticipate, right? You never want to count on something like that. Okay?
They did that on purpose though, right? They did that so that if people want to override their functions, they could do it.
Right, well, they
Right,
did
when
that
they
for
did that?
command precedence. They absolutely did it for command precedence. That's how proxy commands work. right? But I don't know if they truly intended to favor commands in one module. What they did set up were prefixes, right? And prefixes were supposed to be the answer to commands with the same name in different modules. But prefixes do not work consistently. And in fact, when I first put this presentation together, I put prefixes in there, and Joel Bennett on Twitter had a Twitter fit, right? Just hysterics on Twitter because profiles don't work. And I said, well, should I even mention that profiles don't work? And he said not even to utter the word profile. And I always listen to Joel because he's noisier than I am. So in order to get the preferred command, right, you use what we call a module qualified command name. And that's just the name of the module, a backslash, and then the name of the command. And you can do this all the way back in PowerShell 3. It won't work in PowerShell 2. So I'm going to go back here and clear that console. It's probably cleared already. And I'll do a get command on the Microsoft.PowerShell.archive version, and I get it. And I can do the same thing on the pscx version, and I get it. And now, when I run get command for expand archive, it follows the command precedence rules because they're both in the session. Okay? This is when it uses those command precedence rules. Okay? Now, even command precedence can be iffy. If there are two commands of the same type in the session, the default one is the one added to the session most recently. There is no way for you to anticipate what that is, even on your own system, let alone someone else's system that you can't control. So you can use a module qualified command. And I'm actually going to run a module qualified command for you. I'm going to do a little prep in my session. And you'll notice that I'm not using get command or invoke command or anything else. This is a call to the command using a module qualified command. Okay? And this is perfectly legitimate all the way back to PowerShell 3. All the way back to PowerShell 3. And when I run that, it works. Okay? It does exactly what I expect it to do. And I can use module qualified commands in almost any way that I could use a command name. I can use it in get command. I can use it in get help with Microsoft.PowerShell.archive. Oh, that's sad. It's just a dig, right? They didn't put any help for it in there. And I can use it to get help for the pscx object, which actually has help. pscx commandlet. And I can also run it. I ran the Microsoft.PowerShell.archive version, or the pscx version. And I'm just showing you here that I can use the same trick to run the Microsoft.PowerShell.archive version of expand archive. And let's do it here, just to prove that it works on both of them. Oops. Use the force parameter. Well, fail to create file. That prep. Okay. And now it should work. There we go. Cool. So, in order to run the right command, we can use a module qualified command, but we can also use a fully qualified command. And this is a little bit cumbersome, but just follow me here. Let's start the shell and do that again. Okay. So what I have here is the same issue with the expand archive commandlet. But this time, in addition to wanting to specify the module from which it comes, I want to specify the version of the module, and it's not a default version. So what I've done is I've used the required version parameter of import module to import the PSCX module. And then I've used get command with a fully qualified module object that uses one of those module specification hash tables to require the module name, the required version, and the GUID. I save the command that I get in a variable, and then I just invoke the variable. So first what I'm going to do is get the command and save it. Okay. And you can see that, let me just show you. You can see that my little EA variable has my command. And then I use the invoke operator to run the command with the parameters that are specified by the command that's inside the variable. I must have sacrificed a chicken to the right gods. So, when a module name is ambiguous, you use a module qualified command. And when the version or GUID or both are ambiguous, you can use a fully qualified command. So, that's sort of what we need to avoid version chaos. We require a version of PowerShell. We require and import the versions of the modules that we need. We specify the commands that we run, and we make sure to document it. And what's great about this is that once we have it, we can avoid version chaos and still enjoy a multi-version world. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Questions?
What was that editor that you had up earlier?
That's PowerShell Studio?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I haven't used it.
If you go to the back of the room, there's a little flash drive, and it has PowerShell Studio on it.
Or is it just available to download?
It's not free, but
Okay.
the version here is free for 10 days, and then online you get
Oh.
45 more days. And
Okay.
you could play with it for